Hello, folks. It's the most wonderful time of the year. It's cherry blossom time. Well, almost. Those little darlings are trying hard, but they haven't bloomed yet. We're keeping our eyes peeled today as we explore the Tidal Basin cherry blossoms in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Hello, listeners. Today is March 18th, and this is A Garden a Day with Maidenbrock Gardens. Thank you for listening. One of the best signs that spring is finally upon us is the annual tradition of watching Washington, D.C.'s 4,000 cherry trees come into full bloom. For more than a century, the cherry blossom has been a symbol of spring and the unofficial start of the tourist season for Washington, D.C., attracting more than 1 million visitors each year. Last year, 2024, saw a record 1.6 million visitors during the cherry blossom season. Like anything worth pursuing, the Cherry Tree Project started with an idea and took a long time to come to fruition. Most people probably know that the trees were given as a gift to the people of the United States from the people of Japan in 1912. What most people probably do not know is that the idea for planting cherry trees in DC started 27 years earlier, all the way back in 1885. Eliza Skidmore is to thank for coming up with the idea. She had spent time in Japan visiting her brother George, who worked for the U.S. Consular Service. While there, she developed an appreciation for Japanese culture and, of course, for Japanese cherry trees. When she arrived back in D.C. in 1885, she suggested that cherry trees should be planted along the newly reclaimed area along the Potomac River. Later, she would write, "Since they had to plant something in that great stretch of raw reclaimed ground by the riverbank, since they had to hide those old dump heaps with something, they might as well plant the most beautiful thing in the world, the Japanese cherry tree." She approached the superintendent of public buildings and grounds, and her suggestion was met with no interest. She continued to try for the next 24 years, approaching every new superintendent with the same idea. Her requests always fell on deaf ears. A story shared from the National Park Service: one superintendent turned down her request, expressing concern that policemen would have to be in the park day and night when the cherries were ripe to keep boys from climbing the trees and breaking the branches. When Skidmore explained that the types of trees she was proposing produced only blossoms, not cherries, she recalled receiving the following response: "What? No cherries? No cherries? Huff! What good is that sort of cherry tree?" And then along came David Grandison Fairchild, American botanist and plant explorer. He was an interesting person in his own right and deserves an episode of his own, but for now, we focus on the cherry trees. Fairchild managed the Office of Seed and Plant Introduction for the Department of Agriculture, and he too believed the Japanese cherry tree would be a valuable introduction to the American landscape. As a side note, Fairchild is credited with introducing soybeans, pistachios, mangoes, nectarines, dates, bamboo, kale, quinoa, avocados, and 200,000 more plants to the United States. In 1906, Fairchild planted 75 blooming cherry trees and 25 weeping cherries imported from Japan on his own property in Chevy Chase, Maryland, as a test garden. A year later, he deemed the experiment a success and began promoting the blooming cherry as a tree to plant along the avenues of Washington, D.C. In 1907, the Chevy Chase Land Company ordered 300 trees to plant in the Chevy Chase area. And in 1908, Fairchild gave cherry saplings to school children in D.C. schools to plant in their schoolyards for Arbor Day. In a lecture he gave on that day, he advocated for a field of cherry trees to be planted in the area along what is today Independence Avenue and the Tidal Basin. Eliza Skidmore had spoken to David Fairchild, and finally she had an ally. They both began making plans for purchasing trees and found a third ally: First Lady Helen Taft, wife of President William Howard Taft, was working on her own project for beautifying the Potomac Park area. She too had spent time in Japan and appreciated the beauty of the Japanese cherry tree. Skidmore wrote to the First Lady about planting cherry trees in D.C., and Mrs. Taft replied in 2 days with a resounding yes. The very next day, Japanese chemist Dr. Jokichi Takamina, who happened to be in Washington, D.C., heard about the cherry tree project and asked New York's Japanese Consul General Kokichi Mizuno, who also happened to be in Washington, D.C., if he would inquire if Mrs. Taft would accept a gift of 2,000 trees. The consul suggested the trees be given in the name of Tokyo, and all parties agreed. The first shipment of cherry trees arrived in 1910, accompanied by a bit of an embarrassing disaster. Most of the trees were diseased and infested with pests, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture decided it was best to burn them to prevent harm to native plants. Tokyo Mayor Yukio Ozaki showed much grace in the situation and made arrangements for a new shipment of 3,020 cherry trees to be sent to the United States. This time, careful inspection of each tree ensured the trees were healthy and pest-free. The trees arrived in D.C. in March of 1912 and were planted along the Tidal Basin and other areas of the district. Today, nearly 4,000 cherry trees are growing and blooming in Washington, D.C. Of those original trees, fewer than 100 still survive. Peak bloom this year is expected sometime around March 28th to the 31st, but the entire bloom time lasts about 2 weeks. There is a bloom cam, I've included a link in the notes, that lets you see the trees in real time if you're unable to make it to D.C. this spring. The most popular spot for cherry blossoms is the Tidal Basin, but really, if you're in D.C., you can't miss them. A small number are located at the National Mall and near the Washington Monument. There's no bad time to visit, but crowds will be smaller during the work week and in the early morning and evening. The first Cherry Blossom Festival was held in 1935. The Cherry Blossom Festival starts the first day of spring this year, this Thursday, March 20th, and runs through April 13th. There are lots of things to see and do each day with special events scheduled throughout the festival. The Blossom Kite Festival will be held on March 29th and the Petalpalooza on April 5th. Live music, fireworks, parties, and tree plantings are all part of the festival. The Japanese government remains involved in the care of the trees and has donated more trees on special occasions. There will be a Japanese street festival on April 12th and 13th, and the Cherry Blossom Festival Parade on April 12th. And, as an extra bonus for Washington, D.C. visitors, the saucer magnolias are beginning to bloom. Well, that's about it for today's garden visit. Thank you for listening. I do hope you've enjoyed today's episode. As a reminder, we explore a new garden every single day. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star review. And if you haven't done so already, I invite you to like, subscribe, click the check mark, or do whatever you need to do to always get notified when I publish something new. I really do appreciate all the support you lovely listeners have been giving the podcast. It really means a lot. If all goes well, I'll be right back here tomorrow. See you then.